Hey, Eric. Welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Brent, glad to be on with you. Looking forward to our talk.
Yeah. So for those who may not know who you are and sort of what you're working on right now, could you give us kind of the high level overview, the quick tour?
Yeah, sure. I'm the new executive director of the Free State Project, which is a New Hampshire based mass migration movement of libertarians from across the country to practice a concentration strategy, which is basically we are, as libertarians, we're dispersed across the country. We're a diaspora. We're a minority that's easily ignored and dismissed in both the culture and the politics. But if we concentrate in one place, we can have a real impact on the culture and the politics. And this has been going on in New Hampshire for the last 20 years, the live free or die state. And New Hampshire's become the most free state in America, and we continue bringing more Liberty folks here to continue moving the ball forward. So I'm the new executive director. I just started in December. But before that, I've spent really the last 12 years prior to that in the Liberty movement. Started just as like a grassroots Ron Paul guy back in the Tea Party days, joined the Ron Paul campaign, led the efforts in Maine in 2012, and then have spent a decade in politics since then, 3 terms in the Maine State Senate and 2 runs for federal office.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Thanks for that. Um, I have a complicated relationship with politics, right? My listeners probably know I'm a philosophical anarchist. I come at the perspective from an ethical standpoint, and although I was encouraged at times via Ron Paul's various campaigns, I'm sort of been a political observer. I got encouraged, and I sort of watched what they did to him, and sort of what happened, and sort of what the result was, what the output was. And I became, I don't want to say cynical, but I became a little bit, more convinced that maybe politics wasn't the best vehicle for advancing liberty. But I am intrigued. Like the Free State Project is something I've had my eye on for quite a while. I'm sort of supportive of the idea of getting freedom-minded people together in a centralized location to try to, beat back government to some extent, right? And I think that you've probably had some success there. But I just wanted to level set, right? My view of government is typically not good because I do come at it from the ethical perspective. But I'm also a pragmatist too, and I'm also somewhat amenable to the utilitarian arguments, right? And so maybe you could make your case for what you're doing, maybe to somebody like me, right, that is coming at it from a government is force perspective, and you don't change the mafia from being inside the mafia. What am I getting wrong, or maybe you could fill my view out a little bit, maybe some blind spots that I'm not really seeing correctly.
I mean, first of all, how do you know that you couldn't change the mafia from being inside the mafia? Maybe you could. Maybe if a bunch of libertarians entered and took over the mafia, it would start to actually, I don't know, protecting people and not taking their stuff. No. I will say, in defense of kind of being politically involved, I would say my politically involvement, I view it as primarily defensive. And the
Hmm?
only application of state power that I believe in is when we're using state power to defend against arbitrary federal power and nullifying, unconstitutional federal anything that comes down from Washington, D.C., whether it be cannabis prohibition or taking our National Guard troops and sending them off into wars that haven't been properly declared. I believe that, getting involved on the state level, we can make a difference there. And I think that we are seeing that in many states across the country, and nowhere more so than in New Hampshire right now. So, I mean, going back to kind of what you said about, watching what happened in 2012 on the Ron Paul campaign and getting pretty cynical about it. I think that's a fair response. And I certainly know a lot of people who did have that reaction after 2012. I mean, I will tell you, as someone who was elected as a national delegate in 2012 and then had the Mitt Romney campaign and the RNC yank my delegate credentials away and give them to someone else who was going to vote for Mitt Romney over Ron Paul, it would have been easy for me to just say, that's it. I'm done with politics. This isn't for me. But I guess I kind of took the opposite path of saying, these fucking assholes, I'm not going to let them get away with this. This won't be the last they've heard of Eric Brakey. And so for the last decade since, I've been a thorn in their side. And I think considering how many millions of dollars they spent trying to keep me out of Washington, D.C., I think is goes to show that they never forgot what a thorn in their side I have been. But ultimately, I will say, uh, Washington D.C. itself is a bit of a carnival sideshow. I think that we all focus there. That's what the media focuses on. That's what everyone is kind of consumed by in our political discourse. And I think it's valuable to get good people into Washington, the Rand Pauls and the Thomas Masseys of the world. They have a great bully pulpit there to spread the message. But as far as practical, tangible political victories in terms of righting the ship of state and restoring liberty from the federal level on down. Obviously, that doesn't happen. At least I have never seen it happen, and I'm highly doubtful it ever will happen. The very fact of the matter is, it is a fortified citadel of corruption, and it's very hard to get a critical mass of people there when your opponents have they literally have access to a money printing machine, right? Where they can just print trillions of dollars out of thin air, give it out in giveaways to their special interest donors, who then take the money and launder it back to their political campaigns. And so it's very hard to defeat that with just kind of grassroots efforts. Certainly, I know when I running for state Senate versus running for U.S. Senate, when I ran for state Senate, I could knock on every door in the district, meet all the voters, and I was able to win with shoe leather and also some good fundraising, grassroots fundraising. But certainly when you're running for national office, you can't knock on all the doors. It's really just becomes a competition of money. And they've got the money. They've got the money printing machine. So it's going to be hard to change things there. Um, but I think I've got behind me on my bookshelf somewhere the book Nullification by Tom
Mhm.
Woods, which is a great blueprint for how, in getting involved in the state legislatures, we can actively, I think, if you can't, right, if you can't win a direct assault against the citadel of corruption, then maybe you need to find an indirect path to defeat them. And I believe nullification is one of those indirect paths. They cannot enforce their federal laws without the tacit consent of the states. And we have a competitive advantage in more local races because grassroots generally can overcome the power of money in more local races, because it's that shoe leather effect. There's only so much you can pay for. But if you've got people willing to do the hard work on the ground, concentrated in local races, you can really make a difference there. And so that's what I've been at for much of the last decade. Now, of course, with the Free State Project in New Hampshire, the success there is more than anywhere else in the country, because you have thousands of libertarians across the country who are relocating, moving to New Hampshire, and have done so over the course of the last 20 years. And more are coming all the time. And it's this concentration effect. And I will say, to those who maybe aren't so political, and going a political path isn't their way, that they want to make a difference, I would hope that people would at least come out and vote for Liberty candidates who do put themselves out there on the ballot. I do think we need all the votes we can for good people. But there are many paths that people pursue in the movement, and in New Hampshire in particular. So, for example, the New Hampshire Free State Movement really was like one of the early cradles of Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin really found a lot of adopters there who kind of nursed it when it was in the cradle,
Mhm.
and helped it grow big and strong into what it is today, which is, something that is threatening the power of the Federal Reserve banking system. So that was a non-political path to liberty. Other people pursue other non-political paths, whether that's building homeschool networks or agorism. There's many different ways to make a difference. I'm not going to say the political path is the only way, but it is the path that I have the most experience with. But the beauty of our movement is that there's no central plan, and we're all pursuing it in our own fashion. And we're going to hop in with the efforts that are attractive to us, and also that seem to be making a difference.
Cool, cool. And I totally vibe with all of that, right? Like I understand where you're coming from, and I think there's value in what you're doing, even if it means, a temporary restraint on where government could possibly go, right? Like it's a like a little bit of a break effect, slowing things down. But I think there's still something missing, and this is where I'm always coming from. Like people need to embrace the ideas of liberty, right? That could be convinced that this is a better way to live. And I also think the double-edged sword there is that there's so much responsibility that people need to adopt if they want to live in a free world, right? And I
Yeah.
think this is something that people today are largely shunning. And this is what's causing me a little bit of despair. Is there's very few people in this world, particularly in America, that are even engaged with the idea of freedom because it comes with responsibility.
Yes.
And I think one of the most depressing things for me was going through the pandemic and seeing all these people that talked all this stuff, particularly, maybe right leaning libertarians, more that sort of borderline conservative, quote unquote, Republican, maybe libertarian leaning, paleo conservative. These people that talk all this stuff about they're going to, stack up or like all this stuff, right? And when the chips were down, nobody did anything. Like everybody folded, and nobody was like, no, but this isn't happening. And so I'm in a spot where I see the soul of America, and I'm very much questioning whether people really care about liberty, man. So maybe you can give me some encouragement here. Maybe New Hampshire is this beacon that I'm not seeing, but everywhere I look, I want people to say, no, I want to be free, and yeah, that comes with responsibility, and yeah, I've got to do some things, maybe change my life, improve myself, all the things that come along with it. It feels like that's the barrier, right? Like it's the personal responsibility piece that seems to be impeding people's desire to want to be free. It's servitude, as long as your basic needs are taken care of, seems attractive to a lot of people right now for some reason, and that's very depressing for me.
Well, I will say a few things. First of all, I think that you're hitting on something very important as far as a proper understanding of what liberty is, right? A lot of people think liberty is synonymous with freedom, and that's not how I think of it. I think of liberty as that perfect balance between freedom and responsibility, that you're free to do whatever you want in your own life, provided you're not harming other people, and also you take responsibility for the outcomes of your actions, whatever they might be, and don't run to government to socialize the negative consequences of your own bad choices. Because of course you do that, you get moral hazard and you get more people making more bad choices, and it's a spiral to the bottom from there. So liberty is, I like to think, it's the yin and yang of freedom and responsibility. You've got to
Hmm.
accept both of them together. And certainly there are plenty of people who want freedom to do drugs and freedom to do this and do that, which, hey, you want to do that, your body, your choice, but don't expect a welfare check. Uh, uh, you know, if you're not willing to go out and like work a job and take care of yourself, if you can't balance these things and take responsibility for yourself, don't expect the taxpayers of America to pay for it. But sadly, I do think that you're right when it comes to America at large. Ron Paul said freedom is popular, and that's true. But also, I think sadly, we certainly learned during COVID that socialism is popular, and there's a siren song to socialism, right? It sounds nice, it sounds good when you get started, but it does lead. It is a road to ruin. I would say that the Free State Project, however, is built, and the whole point of the concentration strategy is a recognition that this idea we're going to educate the masses out of this situation is delusional. We don't have the power to do that. People are going to continue being offered free stuff and not see that the cheese in the mousetrap is free for a reason. They're going to keep going for it. But if we can't educate our way out of this, if we can't just do mass universal education to bring people to understand the value of liberty and why they should prefer it over socialism, then the only other path is to concentrate those people who already agree on liberty in one place, so that we can, through concentration, um, we can win in the systems, the democratic systems that have been established for how government is directed. We can build culture, and we can reinforce the lessons of freedom and liberty with our children and our communities, kind of for generations going forward. So that's the value of the Free State movement, and the concentration strategy is it doesn't rest around thinking we're going to educate everyone. In fact, the socialists, if people want to do socialism, I'm not a universalist when it comes to libertarianism. I mean, I would ideally love people to agree with me on it, but I'm not going to go around and try to force people to believe what I believe. I would just like people who want socialism to move to Vermont. Go do socialism there, right? And when we all see it's a massive failure of an experiment, we can all learn something from it. But if you want liberty, come to New Hampshire. If you want socialism, go to Vermont. If you want Elizabeth Warren style nanny statism, go to Massachusetts. I do think that the value of kind of the way America was originally constructed is that we were supposed to be able to have these 50 different societies with different values and different ways of organizing, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach being pushed upon us from the top down. And that's what we're trying to achieve in New Hampshire. Come here, come practice liberty, come be in community with other people who care about liberty. And if the rest of the country goes to hell under socialism, at least we'll have this one little piece of land. We'll have our liberty homeland where we can be free.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about the wins. Like I'm, maybe I got a negativity bias and I'm focused on some of the wrong things here. But maybe you could, talk a little bit about how New Hampshire is different. 'Cause you're saying like, hey, come here and live free. What's different from any other state? Like maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, the most obvious things to point to are the policy victories, which I will say libertarians, broadly defined, and not just members of the Libertarian Party, because in New Hampshire, libertarians have effectively taken over the Republican Party, so they run as Republicans. But libertarian Republicans account for a quarter of the New Hampshire House of Representatives now. So there's a bigger concentration in the state house than anyone there. And because New Hampshire has like the biggest state house in the country, there's 400 members. That means there's 100 libertarians in the New Hampshire legislature, and they are in fact the majority of the majority caucus. And so they've been driving a lot of the agenda there. And that has included clear things like, New Hampshire already had no income tax and no sales tax, but they're phasing out even more taxes as they go along. New Hampshire is leading the way on school choice with education freedom accounts, where money follows the child rather than us continuing to funnel these dollars into government monopoly bureaucracies. And something that's very close to my heart, New Hampshire is leading the way on, which is Defend the Guard legislation, which I imagine, are you familiar with Defend the Guard, Brent?
I'm not actually, no.
Okay. All right. Well, boy. All right. I'm excited to explain it to you then and to your audience. So Defend the Guard is a piece of legislation that recognizes that when it comes to our 50 state National Guards who've been deployed over the last 20 years into all the Middle Eastern wars and have accounted for about 50% of the troops on the ground, that the Constitution says that the federal government can only mobilize them under 3 circumstances: to suppress insurrection, repel invasion, or enforce the laws of the Union. And so you look at like Syria, for example. We're not repelling an invasion, we're not suppressing an insurrection, and we're not enforcing any law of the Union because Congress has never voted on it. Therefore, that means that the states have the constitutional authority to call those troops home. If Congress won't go on record with a vote to actually formally declare the war, they don't have the authority to take our National Guardsmen and send them over there to fight it without the consent of the state. And so you have several states now that are advancing Defend the Guard legislation. The New Hampshire House of Representatives just became the first lower chamber to pass it. And also the Idaho Senate has passed it, and the Arizona Senate has passed it. But it's being pushed in state legislatures around the country, largely by liberty legislators and particularly by those with backgrounds in the armed services. And it's a way that the states are pushing back against the war machine. And that's something that New Hampshire is leading the way on. And that's only possible because we've gotten people elected, and people who actually are principled and willing to fight the battles that matter. And it's scaring the Pentagon, because every time it comes forward, they're mobilizing a 4-star general to come and lobby against it and say how terrible it would be. But all we're doing is asking for the Constitution to be observed. So those are things that are happening in New Hampshire because of the concentration strategy. And the great thing is, of course, New Hampshire might lead the way on some of these policies because we are building that kind of libertarian petri dish, right? Of the 50 laboratories of innovation, we are finally building at least one laboratory of innovation where we can enact libertarian policies. And once those policies are enacted in New Hampshire, now you have a model that you can look at and see how it actually is working in practical effect, and other states can follow suit. So a great example of this now, New Hampshire was one of the first states to be a constitutional carry state. They were in the first 10. I don't remember the number. Now, I got it passed in Maine before New Hampshire, so I like to brag about that. But you know, you um, you go back, just like a decade and a half, and there were very few states that had constitutional carry. It was it was something that people were very fear mongering about, that you become the wild, wild west if people didn't have to get a permission slip from the government to carry a firearm, and it would be dangerous, and blood would run through the streets, and yada, yada, yada. You start getting a few states that actually passed it, and we've seen the dominoes start falling across the country, because the sky didn't fall. Many of the states like Maine and New Hampshire that passed it actually became safer, with lower violent crime rates. And now we see that I think something like 30 states across America, over half of all the people living in the country now live in a constitutional carry state. And that's because you had a few states that were really willing to start pushing the ball forward, and lead on that. And that's what New Hampshire can do, when it comes to school choice, when it comes to defend the guard, when it comes to any number of liberty policies that we've always dreamed of being able to pass, but have never really been a reality because we didn't have a practical working political model to make it happen. But we're building that.
Nice, nice. And those are big wins too, because you even look into sales tax alone. You're talking what, 6 to 12% on every transaction. Like that adds up. So and the school choice thing sounds cool. So maybe you could talk about school choice a little bit. I have some questions. So are you saying that everyone by default in New Hampshire gets whatever certain amount of tax dollars that they can direct? Then they can actually choose the school, within I'm sure some constraints there, some legal constraints, but they have the ability to self-direct and send their kid to whatever school they want, roughly.
Yeah, so it's not every family yet. I mean, there are income caps on who can qualify for it, and I think those income caps were something that were accepted to try to get the camel's nose under the tent. And now the effort is to try to keep raising those income thresholds until it covers everyone. But that's always a fight with the Democrats and the teachers unions, of course. Um, but many families qualify, and they can take the tax dollars that would have been allotted for their kid by the state to their assigned public school, and they can take those dollars with them, and they can use those dollars to pay for private school tuition for another public school in a different district where maybe it just is a better fit for their kid, or they can even use it to pay for homeschooling expenses. And we call it an education freedom account. It's kind of like a health savings account, except it's for education purposes, and it is taxpayer money. So, but what is exciting about this is it's like the first time we've really been able to break the education monopoly of the state. Yes, it is still state taxpayer dollars, but look, if we're spending those dollars anyway, who should direct them? Should it be the bureaucracies that direct how those dollars are spent, or should it be ultimately the families who know their kid best and what kind of education they want for their child? So, so that is something that's happened in New Hampshire, and I will say New Hampshire isn't totally unique in that regard. I know several other states have been more and more passing school choice policy, but I believe New Hampshire is the only state in New England, and certainly was one of the first. So New Hampshire really is a standout leader in school choice.
Did the federal government retaliate in some fashion here? Because I know there's this concept of sending it to your federal tax dollars to DC, and somehow they filter through the Department of Education and the bureaucracy and the machine and get filtered back to the states with some strings attached typically. So did you get some strings cut? Did you lose some funding? Like, was there any repercussions to this?
So I think that what we're talking about, and I'm not as great an expert on the policy as some others, but I'm fairly certain the money we're talking about is all state taxpayer dollars. There's no federal taxpayer dollars involved in this program. So as far as the feds are concerned, I don't know of any impact from the feds. There's certainly plenty of other places where the federal government takes our money and ransoms it back to us with strings attached to get us to do whatever the hell they want, even if it's not constitutionally under their jurisdiction. Certainly, education isn't constitutionally under their jurisdiction. Um, but um, but this has been an area I think that still states have really been able to innovate as long as there's been the will to do it. And COVID was a major opportunity to move the ball on school choice because parents finally saw how unaccountable the schools were. And of course, with like a lot of the Zoom teaching, they got to see firsthand some of the stuff their kids were learning, and maybe they weren't always happy with it. So it became a real opportunity with a lot of demand for change. So because we had libertarians in the right place at the right time in the political power structure, we were able to seize upon that opportunity and move the ball forward on education choice.
Nice, nice. So that's definitely a big win. I think education is so important. I think a lot of people in the public school system, myself included, where we suffer from a lot of indoctrination. You
Yeah.
walk in on day one, you start chanting to the dear leader, pictures of dear leader and the flag, and and
And,
you
and
learn.
and they tell us there's no religion in the schools. They tell us it's secular, right?
Yeah, it's a secular religion, as we all know. So, no, but I think that we all get this homogenous programming from a very early age, and that sort of is difficult to break away from. It's this sort of program, like almost like a computer virus that gets embedded in everyone's brain that runs in the background. And unless you intentionally engage with the concepts of philosophy, generally speaking, and then obviously around the concept of non-aggression and liberty in general, it's very hard to break out of that paradigm. And so I think this is somebody for me who's very skeptical of political approaches. This one to me resonates quite a bit as far as an interrupter of some of that stuff.
Yeah, well, and I will say in New Hampshire, I had the great opportunity to take a tour of like this free state homeschool co-op called like Latitude Learning. It's basically like free staters or just liberty loving people in New Hampshire like have their kids involved in this co-op, and they're learning all kinds of stuff, very practical skills. I'll tell you, I had some of these kids at the Porcupine Freedom Festival this year because we have a lot more families coming. Anyway, those who don't know what the Porcupine Freedom Festival is, it's our annual week-long kind of camping festival at Rogers Campgrounds in Lancaster, New Hampshire. But we've been trying to do a lot more as there are more and more families in the movement, and there were over 400 kids there this year. Trying to do a lot more programming for both the young kids and the older kind of teens and preteens. And I decided to do a mock legislature for the older kids, like 10 to 17, where kind of we gave them the opportunity to form political parties, run for Speaker of the House, and take a bill all the way through the entire lawmaking process. And I'll tell you, I've done this exercise with students in my local public schools in my Senate district in Maine, and I love doing it. Love working with the kids. But of course, the different bill proposals you get from them, oftentimes, usually there's some statist, there's some statist idea or another. Occasionally, they ask for freedom, like the freedom to own hedgehogs as pets, which was a great one. But at the Porcupine Freedom Festival, like these Free State kids, they came up with a policy proposal that is so based that I don't know that I can repeat it.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I'll just say they are not fans of Washington D.C. and these it was really awesome to see kind of the values that these kids have. That look, I grew up a neoconservative, and I had to like break free of that mental prison that that was imposed on me by the corporate press and all the propaganda in the schools and everything else. But to see these kids who kind of have this, I mean, you've got like like 17-year-olds saying like I'm an anarcho-capitalist. It's like 17. I hadn't even heard of anarcho-capitalism, but we're kind of a real strong community is being built in New Hampshire, and people are starting to raise the second generation. And I look forward to seeing what these kids do, even if they do something like run for the legislature. These are they give me a lot of hope for the future that these kids they've got their heads screwed on straight and they understand what's what.
Man, that is super cool. That gives me a little bit of secondhand hope because I'm struggling with a little bit of it. My story, like I lived in Utah for a while, super red state, super neocon, particularly at the time I lived there. Moved to Washington, lived in Seattle for over a decade, and recently, 2 years ago, I escaped to Nashville. And it
Yeah.
seems like I'm constantly bouncing back and forth between red team, blue team, and there's no freedom anywhere. It's just a question of which freedoms are, popular to infringe upon, right? Like it's just what team are we supporting here?
Yeah.
And so
Is
even hearing those anecdotes of kids talking that way, that made me feel pretty good. I would love to see more of that here in Nashville. Like I'm very, like I said, very much into a red state. Nashville's a very purple city, and so it's just there's a lot of yuck going on here in the local scene. I would never, I can't imagine somebody saying like anything like that around me. It's a little bit of a bummer. So I'm really glad you told that story.
Well, I know not to sell you on your own state, but I know a good friend down there, Glenn Jacobs, who
Oh, he's in
uh,
Knoxville, right? He's
Knox,
the
Knox County, Tennessee, mayor there. I keep hearing rumors he might be running for governor of Tennessee, which would be awesome to see. I mean, he's like probably the only person who can, he's WWE superstar Kane, right? He's the only
Kane.
person
Yeah.
who can body slam you while quoting Mises and Rothbard. Um, anyway, that'd be interesting. But if he does that, but of course, have you ever been up to visit New Hampshire? You ever come to any of the Free State events that we do
I
each year?
haven't. I haven't. Like I said, I've been an observer. Like I said, I've been in the liberty space for a long time, multiple decades, and I'm aware of it. You sort of see stuff online. I know the personalities that are in the space here, but
Yeah.
but for me, I've never done a lot of participation. Like I said, maybe it's because I'm a little bit cynical. Not cynical. I don't think cynical is the right word. I'm skeptical of political action. Like I've seen that. I don't see an end to it. I think Tolkien was absolutely right when he wrote Lord of the Rings. It's like state power is
Yeah.
the metaphor is the ring of power. Like no man can wield it at any level, state, county, federal. It doesn't matter, right? Like this is something that a man cannot have that type of power over another man, like or woman, whatever. Like it's just not possible. So for me, I struggle. Like I really struggle, and I want to be convinced. Like maybe that's one of the reasons I'm asking you to convince me, because I would love to. And my brother-in-law tries to convince me to. Why don't you just vote in the local elections? And I'm like, man, I don't know. Maybe I will. I'm still on the fence about it. But to me, it's just like I see that so clearly that no matter where you start on the liberty spectrum, right? You talk about 1776. We went for the experiment in the smallest government the world has ever seen.
Yeah.
In a couple hundred years, it's turned into the largest, most expensive, most tyrannical government that the world has ever seen. And I think Tolkien has it right. As soon as you grant that specific right to say, like, if you work for the state or government, and when I say state, everyone, I want you to understand, I mean work for the government. You are a special class of human being that gets extra rights that nobody else gets, and that the rights are to assault, to kill, to steal, right, to enslave. Like these are things that come part and parcel with working for the government. And if as long as you grant that special right to anybody, eventually, no matter how small you start, it's going to turn into complete full-blown tyranny. I think it's going to initially have a boom. You're going to be amazingly prosperous, and that type of prosperity is going to attract parasites, the parasite class who want to wield that ring of power, and it's going to turn into Mordor everywhere, every single time. And so I really struggle. So maybe, man, I'm reaching. Please convince me. To tell me what I'm getting wrong. Like why should I have a cause for
I
hope
mean,
here?
I think you're ultimately right about the nature of power, and I think that I often think of Washington D.C. as the One Ring. I think you got to see like when Donald Trump became president, you got to see like the people who'd wielded the ring for for a long time, like suddenly act like Gollum, like doing everything they could to get it back because they were separated from it. Um, but certainly, like, I think a good libertarian knows if you ever get that ring of power, you've got to be prepared to throw it into Mount Doom, and destroy it. And ultimately, um, you know, power should not be centralized, at least not through force. If power becomes centralized, it should be because people have opted into it, and they could just as easily opt out if that power is abused. So under the system as it is, right? I'm not looking to use state power to solve people's problems in their personal lives. I'm trying to use state power to combat the abuse of federal power, and I want to otherwise minimize the use of state power against peaceful people. I want to phase out taxes as much as possible. I want to leave peaceful people alone to make their own decisions in their own lives. But the sad thing is that if we do not occupy that space of these positions, then we surrender those spaces to statists, right? And we as libertarians, I think, are at a natural disadvantage in some regard, just because instinctively, right, our instincts are to run for the hills, not to run for office. But the people who want power, they instinctively run for office, and so even there's just a self-selection there, and kind of the worst getting on top. But in New Hampshire, I think that people have really there's a big understanding that if we want to change things, we've got to be willing to jump in. Now, running for office isn't for everyone. Again, I mentioned there are many different ways people are making a difference. Running for office is just one of those ways. Um, but beyond even just the holding political office, in New Hampshire, I mean, what's really beautiful about what's being built there is the community itself. Is the simple fact of, you can spend your days in community with thousands of people who share your values, who understand the non-aggression principle, and whatever disagreements you might have with them, they're not going to turn to the government and hurt you or take your stuff, because there's a shared understanding that's not how we do things. And the more people who come, the more democratic power we have to create a libertarian society and change the laws in that fashion, or just to build community through more informal means, and ignore the state in our own ways. So I would really, encourage you. We just had the Porcupine Freedom Festival, so it won't be back for another year. But now's a good time to look at your calendar and ask yourself if you could come up next June. I'll tell you, I don't know anyone who's come to PorcFest who regrets it. It's like a great libertarian retreat, with to be engaged in dialogue and community with people and thinkers from all across the country, and would love to have you there, Brent.
Awesome. I will certainly consider it. I definitely thought about it, particularly now that I'm creating content and have the podcast. I've been kind of trying to avoid the libertarian stuff, but I keep getting sucked into it. I want to talk about so many other topics, but it is near and dear to me, and it just for some reason it seems to keep finding me. So it'd be a good opportunity to interview some people in real life. I will certainly consider it for next year.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you, I mean, the talks that happened there, we're not all like sitting around talking about like, you know, the intricacies of the Libertarian Party. In fact, I think that the Libertarian Party was hardly mentioned at all, at PorcFest. And we're not necessarily even talking about just politics in general. I mean, we're talking about different policies and things like that. But there's debates about, should libertarians be vegan or not? Is like, or I don't know. Anyway, I was just picking one of the more obscure topics, but there's all kind of talks going on, both in terms of the formal Free State Project programming, where we bring in speakers on the main stage. But one of the beautiful things about PorcFest too is that, like, anyone can build anything, right? In the campgrounds, people are starting their own hubs, their own sites, where they're hosting talks and dialogues on whatever they care about. And so it really is kind of it's really, you bring the people together and you empower people to build what they want, the kind of pop-up society they'd like to live in for a week. So it's a beautiful thing, and you'd love it. I hope you
Yeah,
join us
that
next year.
sounds super cool, and I would love to get up to the Northeast. It's been a while for me, so I would love to do that. I'm gonna 100% consider that seriously. So, thanks for the invite. I've been thinking about it for years, and I typically I'll see it pop up like, oh, Pork Fest is going on, and like, oh well, maybe some other time. So I'll actually put some serious thought into it because it does sound very cool, and it's definitely people that I would vibe with. So I will consider it. Uh, can I pivot quickly and ask you some personal philosophical questions? Just because
Sure.
I'm insanely curious about this stuff. You said some things that led me to believe that you had some affection for the Constitution. We start talking about the guard bills and protect our guard or whatever it was called, and that's very much in line with the Ron Paul style of libertarianism, right? So I'm trying to figure out from your perspective, like, how do you view the Constitution? Do you think that it's valid? Do you think that it is, invalid but utilitarian, like, or has some sort of utility with respect to protecting liberty in some form? Like philosophically, how do you view a document like the Constitution?
Well, there's certainly many legitimate criticisms you can make about the Constitution, and you could certainly argue that the Constitution shouldn't bind any I never signed it, you never signed it. You can make
Mhm.
these arguments, shouldn't bind us. But I think that ultimately, when people make those arguments, I think it's a misunderstanding of what the Constitution actually is. It's not a document that's supposed to bind us. It's a document that's supposed to bind the government, right? And so I think the value of the Constitution today is primarily to point out, sometimes I think the irony of those who kind of chant law and order, it's like, well, your government doesn't follow any law, right? Here's the law that they're supposed to be ruled by, and they blatantly ignore it, right? They don't respect the Bill of Rights. They don't stay within their Article 1, Section 8, limited powers. And so I view the Constitution as very valuable in that sense, if nothing more than to point out that we have an illegitimate government that doesn't follow its own laws. So that's the value I see. I mean, some people argue maybe the Articles of Confederation were better, they were more decentralized, maybe. That there's an interesting conversation to be had there. But certainly, I mean, if we are going to have a government, I would much rather there be a constitution that we can point to, and that has some pull on them, from going totally tyrannical. I recognize that over the course of the last 2.5 centuries, our government has drifted very far away from it, but still we have that thing we can point to and use as a weapon to fight back against them. So. And I do think that ultimately, I think the Constitution, as far as charters for a government in the history of the world, is one of the better ones out there. There's a lot when maybe one day in the future when this government collapses and the empire falls, and maybe 2,000 years from now, they're doing what our founders did, learning from the failures of past civilizations for how to create a better government. There's certainly a lot of lessons they could learn from this experiment, and maybe craft something even better. But yeah, that's how I view it.
So I'm going to push back slightly. So you said that the Constitution only binds the government, where I don't think that's true, right? Because the Constitution enumerates powers, right? It's not just a prohibition and a binding. I agree that's part of it, right? It
Mm.
was intended to bind the federal government, but on the flip side, it also enumerated powers that were given to the federal government, right? And so I guess my question, being a philosophical one, is like, do you believe that's valid, right? The powers that the government claims that are enshrined in the Constitution, is it are we bound to that as human beings? Does that document legitimately bind us to that agreement?
So, are we bound to it in the sense that, like, let's say our government did operate completely within the confines of the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, and then they said, and because we're going to provide for the common defense, we need to lay taxes on
Mhm.
you. Are you obligated to pay those taxes? Um, you know, in that scenario where they are behaving constitutionally.
Exactly
Um,
my question. Thank you for grokking it appropriately.
um, I mean, I, I would say no. You aren't. I guess from the perspective of kind of natural rights, I would say no. I certainly would prefer to see a system where um, people, you know, I mean, I'd much prefer to see a system where people find voluntary ways to take care of things like the common defense. And I think that we could figure that out if we weren't stuck in the status paradigm where one group has to have a monopoly on this, and of course, when you have that, and they can just take your money, regardless of the quality of the services they're delivering, you're not going to get good quality of services, and you're going to get bloated budgets and all the rest. Um, so I'd say from a pure natural rights perspective, which I kind of fall in the tradition of natural rights, I would say you probably aren't obligated. You never signed that contract. But what a beautiful world it would be compared to the one that we live in today, if that was the situation that we had, where they were actually constrained to those powers. And so, yeah.
Thank you, and I appreciate the uncomfortable nature of that question. That is a difficult one to sort of. That's a difficult needle to thread. So I appreciate the direct answer. It's a challenging one, but I think you nailed it. I think there is a gradient with respect to how governments operate, right? Like there's a better and a worse. I think anyone who looks at it in a purely binary fashion, a black and white fashion, is missing the forest for the trees. But I also like to understand where people are coming from a philosophical perspective, because I think particularly a lot of the right libertarians, they do seem to have a lot of affection, almost like I said, that sort of like "Hail, dear leader," almost a religious fervor to the Constitution. It's almost on par with the whatever scripture that they hold dear.
Mm.
And to me, that's a little bit creepy. I've always kind of bristled at that from a natural rights standpoint, because you talk to these people and like, no, it's the whole social contract theory. If you don't like it, move to Somalia. And that sort of thing is never really resonated with me. I think it's completely ghastly from a moral standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I will say in defense of, I think, those who get really have a lot of pride about the Constitution and the flag and the country. Like I think, I will say I do think I have a lot of patriotism. I do love the country. I just don't love the government, and I do like the kind of the founding ideals that the. I mean, frankly, I think the Declaration of Independence articulated the founding ideals pretty well, and it was the Constitution um, tried to, in some ways, to kind of guarantee natural rights very imperfectly. Um, but it's you know I do think it's sometimes certainly, as we saw in the George W. Bush era, patriotism, I think, is a virtue. Love of your country, I think, is a virtue. But we've certainly seen how political operators can play upon your patriotism and manipulate you to do very
Mm.
to go halfway around the world and blow people up who never harmed you. So we do have to remain, I believe, have some degree of objectivity and not be blinded by these passions.
Yeah, and that's a really difficult one. I think that is another one that's not binary. There is some gradation there. Patriotism, when you think about it, is essentially tribalism, and human beings are tribal species, and
Yeah.
people love to have a symbol to rally around. And you want to have a particular geography that this is us, and there's an other that's on the other side of the line. Sports teams do it, right?
Yep.
It's all very tribal. So I do believe there is a unifying aspect to the concept of patriotism, but I've never really been able to understand fully the concept of being proud of or supporting your country without your government, right? Because the country is technically defined. The boundaries are drawn by the government, right? This isn't
Mhm.
private property we're talking about. This is like,
Mhm.
hey, some folks said we will defend these arbitrary lines in the sand with violent force. Um, and so to be proud of this arbitrary region to me is something I've struggled with quite a bit, because it just the logical part of my brain doesn't make any sense. When I lived in Seattle, I was much closer to my neighbors in Vancouver, Canada. Like I could throw a rock and hit those folks, but for some reason, I should feel closer to somebody that's in Key West, Florida. Because we operate under the same government. And so I always had a disconnect there. And I'm not saying like my way
Yeah.
is right. That's just my brain has a very difficult time reconciling those concepts.
Well, what I would say to that is I think that, it used to be, certainly maybe less and less these days, but there was a really strong sense of identity in terms of what it meant to be an American. And I think, kind of going back to what you say, that we're tribal creatures. That's how we evolve. We're always looking for the us versus them. And so if it's inevitable that we are going to form tribes, then the question is kind of what kinds of tribes should we form? And I think that the beauty of kind of the American tribe has been kind of that we hearken back to these certain founding ideals that are rooted in libertarian thought or classical liberal thought.
Hmm.
Inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and government exists to protect those rights. And if it fails to do so, we have the right to alter or abolish that government, right? I mean, these are when I think of like American patriotism, it helps that American patriotism, I think, is so much rooted historically in those founding ideals and those founding documents. Now, And this is why I find a lot more hope for the right in America than like the right in maybe European countries, where, to be a conservative in a country whose tradition is uh, various forms of like authoritarianism, right? Then you're hearkening back to the old days when we had the monarchs and the rulers and the aristocracy, right? So it's a different kind of conservatism. It really depends on the context that you're in. Our traditions, that at least back in the Tea Party day and the Ron Paul days, are traditions that conservatives were seeking to conserve in that moment, were our libertarian traditions. And where was I going with that? And so that if we are and I think this is ultimately also one of the things that I think is great about America compared to many other countries. It's like, if you ask someone like, what does it mean to be an American, right? You can have a lot of different thoughts that come to mind. But if you were to ask someone, what does it mean to be Japanese, right? You think of a very particular thing. You think of
Mm.
someone of a certain ethnicity, or what does it mean to be French? Or what does it mean to be British? You start thinking about ethnicities. But what does it mean to be an American? You don't, at least I don't know about other people. Maybe other people think of different things, but I don't think of someone's skin color or their religion or any of these things. I think of ideas of liberty. And that's kind of what the basis of what it meant to be an American. It's this idea, this identity group, this tribal group that's open to anyone who wants to come and participate in our ideas of what American liberty is, right? And so I think that's kind of, as far as kind of like tribal groups, I think those kind of tribal groups formed around ideas are much healthier than kind of racial and ethnic tribal groups, which is what we see around the world. But of course, that can also be perverted, and we've certainly seen throughout American history where being an American means, the outgroup is people we've got to go to war with for no reason whatsoever. So there's a dark side to everything.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm not claiming that's a simple topic. I don't believe it is. I think this is a vastly complex topic, and honestly, being an anarchist, if somebody, and I've said this a million times, if somebody gave me the magic wand and said, if you could abolish the government tomorrow, would you do it? I'd be like, not in a million years. I think the free markets are superior to government in every way, all the time. But I also think without intentional adoption of the concepts of liberty by the people, regardless of where these folks are, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. Some of these structures, I'm a student of history and also of evolution, and I understand these are evolved structures, right? Typically, anything that the government does today worldwide is a response to a problem that humans encountered society wide, right? So I understand, and I'm not like it's almost like the new atheists that want to throw out all of Western civilization because they don't believe Christianity is true. It's like, regardless of whether it's true, there's some utility in that function.
Yeah.
Unless you replace it with something else intentionally, you're going to cause all sorts of unintended consequences. And so I'm very well aware that these functions exist. But I don't necessarily see a clear path to moving towards a more free market. It's very disheartening, and I do agree with you. By the way, I'm like almost 50, and I grew up at a time where people were more unified. Like most people, at least, would say, even if they weren't, really deep students of philosophy and understand the concepts of liberty, they would at least say those words. That America stands for freedom, and they could enumerate some of the Bill of Rights and say, like, we actually value these things as a whole. And I think with the introduction of the socialism, the Marxism, the cultural leftism, I think that has really polluted the sort of populace and the mindset that we have. And you can talk about the degradation of people that identify as religious in some
Yeah.
fashion, and the decline societally. We're in a rough spot, honestly, and
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, man, and I think that's why a big part of why we have seen kind of the reemergence of all this racial politics in America is, there has been this like cultural Marxist attack on kind of the American identity itself. And so as that kind of American identity breaks down and kind of what it means to be an American and these kind of shared values of that mission statement of America as articulated in the Declaration of Independence, as we're told we need to throw that all away, We need to tear down the statues to the founders. There's nothing of value to be learned from these old white men. You know, then yeah, we don't have that shared basis anymore to form a civilization, and we start to fight and degrade within society and fight against each other. And we start to see, I mean, boy, it seems like the media, the corporate press has been, I don't know. It seems to me ever since like the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street started, like from the left and the right populist movements going against the actual dangerous power structures that are oppressing us, it seems like they've certainly been very focused, those power structures, on trying to turn us against each other with culture wars and race politics, as like this divide and conquer strategy. So we're focused on our neighbors as the enemy rather
Yeah.
than the bankers and the government officials who are actually stealing our freedoms and our paychecks from us every day. So I'd love to see us kind of find that kind of shared sense of identity again, and keep it rooted in these ideas that we want to respect individual freedom and liberty for everyone. And if we find that again, perhaps kind of the left and the right can reunite against the real oppressors in society.
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, and long term, I hope that we get there. I think there might be some bumps along the road. So I'm going to end with a very simple question, just super simple. You're a smart guy. You've been in politics. You know very well and can do basic arithmetic. The United States government is not going to balance their budget, and they're going to default. The USD is
One of
headed
these
for a
days.
yeah, it's going to
Yeah.
happen, right? And we all know that we're already fractured as a society, and as you mentioned, we're moving towards potential balkanization. The United States might rip apart. So with that bright and cheery backdrop, have you thought about those things with respect to the Free State Project? And if so, how are you considering what you're doing there and the work in New Hampshire with that backdrop?
Well, certainly, if and when that day comes, I think New Hampshire is the place you're going to want to be. I will say the Free State Project does not endorse secession. There's different people have different minds of that within the Free State movement, but certainly, if the day comes, like it did for the Soviet Union when it all falls apart, I think the Free State movement in the state of New Hampshire maybe is as well positioned, and people have been thinking about how you do this when that day comes. So we're just going to keep building parallel institutions. We're going to keep building up our liberty community in New Hampshire, and when that day comes, I imagine probably the state governments will still exist. It'll be maybe Washington D.C. that we finally get to disregard, and they can't bribe us with our own money anymore because the money won't be worth anything. So yeah, until that moment happens, we're just going to keep building community and positioning the liberty movement to be in the place to push things in the right direction when it happens. And if anyone would like to be a part of what we're building in New Hampshire, people can learn more at fsp.org. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Senator Brakey, where I'm always throwing out my thoughts of the moment.
Great, great. Well, hey, I know I gave you some tough questions, and I hope I didn't come across as being cynical or negative. I swear I'm not. I'm definitely
No,
optimistic, and
enjoy
man,
the conversation.
I love people who are out there actively trying to make the world a better place, and I consider you and the FSP and the folks in New Hampshire in that camp. So I just want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I wish you absolutely nothing but the best of luck going forward.
Thank you, Brent.
All right, thank you.